Welcome to this media briefing on COVID-19, organised by the Biotechnology Innovation Organisation, the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network, and IFPMA. My name is Claire Dool, and I'm your moderator. Today, we'll focus on the COVID-19 manufacturing scale-up that's happened in the past 12 months and the challenges ahead for next year. Journalists from now on, that's 1400 p.m. Central European Time, 8 a.m. Eastern Time. You can now start submitting your questions in the chat box. Do include your name and who you're working for, and tell us who you would like to answer your question. We're going to be answering those questions in the second part of this briefing, once our speakers have set the scene. We have with us today Thomas Cueni, Director General of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, President and CEO, Biotechnology Innovation Organisation, representing pharma companies, biotechs, academic and research institutions across the United States and in more than 30 countries. Prasad, Executive Director, Quality Operations, Bharat Biotech, and President, Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network. DCVMN represents over 42 manufacturers based in 15 countries, including India, Brazil, and South Africa. And Rasmus Bech Hansen, CEO and founder, Airfinity, an independent life science analytics company. Rasmus is going to start by sharing his data to help frame the conversation. Rasmus, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and hi everyone, and welcome to this. And thank you first to IFPMA, Bio, and DCVMN for inviting me to provide a high-level overview of where we've been this year, the remarkable results we've seen from the industry this year, but also looking ahead to what are some of the things we can expect in 2022. I will be sharing my screen, and I should also say that this presentation is available on the IFPMA website, and feel free to share this. So I will get started. Hope you can all see my screen, otherwise let me know. So it's been it's quite remarkable when we look back at 2021. I find it actually hard to believe that it is less than a year ago that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine got its first WHO emergency listing. I think we had the first media brief with IFPMA also about a year ago, and the situation looked so remarkably different at then. Already in March, we had a billion doses of vaccines produced globally, which in itself is a big achievement. I think no one had believed that that would happen so fast. Already in August, the total global production exceeded 1 billion doses per month. And I'll get back to where we are now, but already much higher. In that period, we've had 8 vaccines approved by WHO. So also, I think, an incredible result. We could mention many more things that has been achieved throughout the year. It's the global vaccination campaign has been extraordinary, but those were kind of just some of the kind of key highlights from an industry perspective. However, if we look at the global situation, I think it's fair to say that we are still in very challenging times. If we look at the bottom left, we can see that cases globally are rising quite significant. We are sadly not far from the biggest peak we had in 2021. We've had almost 300 million cases reported to date. And I think that's fair to say that that's probably an underreporting, given that not all countries we don't have test capacity in all countries. If we look at global deaths, they're still high. Yesterday, there were reported 9,000 deaths globally. So a significant number of people are sadly losing their lives daily to COVID-19. But I think the good news here, or the positive news here, is that if you see the link between the deaths and the cases, there isn't the same correlation as we've seen in the past, where you can see that the deaths kind of follow a little bit with a time lag from the cases globally. And that is, I think, largely due to the slide to the right, which shows the global vaccinations. So 57% of the adult population has achieved or have gotten one dose of vaccines. So I think that's remarkable. We see that steady increase. Now we're also starting to see the booster shot coming up, and I think it's promising to see in many countries the booster campaign are actually getting off to a really good start and very high rates. If we look at the global situation in terms of cases, just one more point here is that it's still Delta dominated, but Omicron is growing extremely fast. Many places has become the dominant strain in some countries, especially South Africa, as I think we all know, but we also expect it to become dominant in UK and other places over the coming weeks and months. And it's hard to not see a situation where Omicron would be dominant if we look 1 to 2 months ahead, pretty much all over the world, as we are seeing it detected in more than 82 countries to date. Looking a little bit more into the production, so we expect that the world would have produced around 11.2 billion doses by the end of the year. So really, an extraordinary number. And the total global capacity is around 1.4 billion. So month on month. So right now, we as a world can produce 1.4 billion. The major producers, as we can see here, are Pfizer, BioNTech, Sinovac, Sinopharm, and AstraZeneca. Those are kind of dominating the market, those 4 vaccines, but we're also seeing Moderna and others beginning to produce at large scale. From a country perspective, where these vaccines produced, 2021 really was. We really saw the rise of China. I think that has taken us all a bit by surprise. The number of doses produced out of China. So China is now the world's largest vaccine producer. European Union also has increased a lot, and India, less surprising, but India is also is the 3rd largest producer, followed by the US, and then a number of other countries are also starting to ramp up their vaccine production. The big question then becomes, if we look into 2022, I think with the development we've seen in 21, one should be a bit cautious to kind of trying to predict too much in what's going to happen in 22. But if we look in at least 6 months ahead, then with the current production levels, we would expect to see 8.6 billion vaccines produced by end of June next year. So that's like more than the world needs for one vaccine per capita. However, there are lots of uncertainties around that. I think one of the key uncertainties is, do we need a new vaccine target Omicron? And we've done kind of different models on that, and I won't go into details, but just to say that if part of the global production starts to be diverted into Omicron vaccine production, that will have significant impact on the global vaccine production availability, as it takes time to shift over the production, it takes time to ramp up production. So here we modeled what that would mean. If half of the production capacity went for Omicron, then we would see a quite significant reduction of global vaccines by mid-year. How it's going to end at the end of the year, it could be 17, maybe even 20 billion if we continue with the existing, but it could also be significant less. We also expect some vaccine producers to be taken out of the market, as there might not be demand for them. If we look at donations, then we have seen over the last couple of months quite an increase in global donations. We're still seeing lots of disparity in terms of total vaccination rates, country to country. Big parts of the world still not anywhere close to fully vaccinated. But nonetheless, we have seen a ramp of donations. Around more than 1 billion vaccine doses have been donated to date. Around half of them bilateral donations, and the other half either either through COVAX procured or through the COVAX mechanism. We also analyzed the surplus doses, and I think a really important point here is that there are still available doses for further donations, according to our estimates. Even with the current booster, accelerated booster campaigns, there will be available doses, and here in the upper graph you can see the reduction that boosters for all adults have, and the availability has some reduction, but it doesn't mean that there isn't available doses. Then looking a little bit further into how have these vaccines performed against the different variants. So we saw in 2021, we saw Delta overtaking the original strain. And I think it's been positive to see that, that the vaccines has actually held up quite well against Delta. Some reduction against symptomatic infection, but actually quite small reduction against hospitalization. As you can see here across some of the major vaccines. Big question mark that the world is now asking, of course, is how does that look against Omicron? And it's very, very early days, and I really should caution against drawing any conclusions on this. But it does seem that it has that the vaccines are holding up less well against Omicron, at least against symptomatic infection. There's also been some recent studies out in the last couple of days showing somewhat of reduction against hospitalization and more severe disease. Still early days, but it's definitely a very important one to follow for the world. And I would expect that we will have more information and more solid evidence actually as soon as in a month's time. But that's also why, because of that, and because of potential new variants that could come and potential new development you can't expect, that's also why we're continuing to see a really kind of very active, strong development in the pipeline. So here I've kind of mapped out what are the vaccine candidates. We have more than 358 vaccine candidates in preclinical still, and then moving into phase 1, 2, and 3, also a large number of candidates. 41 are in phase 3. I think that's in itself is quite a remarkable number. So that means that we will see a continued innovation and inflow of new vaccines to the market. And what are then some of kind of the, let's say, interesting innovation we can expect? So I think one of the really interesting things would be a combination vaccine. So could we get a vaccine that could protect not just against COVID-19, but against flu, against RSV, and potentially other respiratory diseases? Here we have quite a lot of candidates out, both in preclinical and a few in clinical. Another interesting and I think very important innovation is alternative routes of administration, as there's no doubt that the needle injection are keeping some people from getting vaccinated. So we're seeing intranasal, we're seeing oral, we're seeing needle-free injection innovations coming to market. Some of them are already in clinical. And then lastly, to the point about Omicron, what are we seeing here? Yeah, also here we're seeing significant scientific resources being devoted to developing new vaccines against the Omicron variant. Many of the major vaccine producers are already doing that, and we have kind of a timeline on how long that would take to bring those to market. But I think the important point here is looking into 2022, we can expect significant innovations and scientific progress as we have already witnessed in 21. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Rasmus. Yes, indeed, as you say, there has been significant innovation with this vax production over the past year being more than 11 billion, and indeed more innovation going forward. And we'll talk about that later, but perhaps if I just begin with Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath. Rasmus says it has been a remarkable year for the industry. Biotech such as Moderna and BioNTech, mRNA technology has been really pioneering in the fight against COVID-19. How would you describe this year for your sector?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And I have to take this opportunity to just thank Rasmus and his team at Airfinity for really doing such an amazing job throughout the year to pull all this incredible data together. So just as it's been an amazing year for data, it has been a phenomenal year for the science. If you think back to where we were a year and a half ago, it was quite daunting. And while we still have quite a bit of a path to cover before we get to a place where we feel we have this pandemic fully under control, I think we have to think about what we set out to do. We set out to decouple infection from death and disability. And we are starting to see quite a bit of that decoupling. And that is incredibly promising, and it's incredibly helpful and useful. I read a report yesterday that estimates that the mRNA vaccines in the US alone have saved more than 1 million lives in this last year. I mean, you can think of another medical innovation that within its first year of use saved 1 million lives. It's absolutely miraculous. So we have to really tout the scientists and the companies that have really dedicated and pivoted to trying to combat COVID. And it's not just in the vaccine space. We've seen over 1,000 research and development programs started over the last year and a half to try to stop and combat COVID. Over 60% of these research projects have actually been undertaken by small biotech companies. And you've seen the partnerships between these small companies like Moderna, like Novavax, like Biotech, with some of our larger manufacturers to really make these breakthroughs available to more and more people. So we've seen unprecedented science based on decades of foundational research. We've seen unprecedented speed of innovation getting out to patients. And we've seen just a breathtaking amount of scaling in a very short amount of time to make these innovations available around the world, even though we have much more to do to make sure that we get vaccine acceptance and access for every patient in the world.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath. Thomas, you're the Director General of the IFPMA, and you represent the pharmaceutical industry with the WHO here in Geneva and the UN generally. What do you observe has been done which is so radically different than in previous vaccine rollouts?
I think there are three things, Claire. First, the speed of development, as Michelle already indicated. Previously 4 years fastest vaccine ever developed here, 326 days. I think it's still important to recall that Margaret Keenan, the first person to get a vaccine, this was on December 8, 2020, barely a year ago. The second one is clearly the size of the scale-up of manufacturing. Pre-COVID-19, global vaccine capacity manufacturing was 5 billion doses for all vaccines put together, including seasonal flu vaccination. Now this year, we are beyond, as we just heard from Rasmus, 11 billion doses just for COVID-19. And I think the third element is really the unique nature of partnership across the industry, but also with regulators, with public authorities, with academics, that I think wouldn't have been possible. But when you look at this scale, it's not surprising. And I think many people expected you have the first vaccine approved, 31st December, EUL for Pfizer BioNTech, and then you push the red button and the billions roll out. Not quite. And I just want to remind you that in March this year, our colleagues from from DCVMN, and we lined up with Chatham House to look at some of the bottlenecks we expected on scarcity of raw materials, bottlenecks of supply chain, trade barriers, export restrictions. But there were also bumps along the road. We have seen some of the biggest vaccine manufacturers not yet able to come up with a COVID-19 vaccine. We have seen bottlenecks or bumps and disappointments in scaling up. Some of the most seasoned and experienced biological contract manufacturers, CRMs, are not there where they wanted to be or actually failed in terms of scaling up. And still we did reach these 11 billion, more than 11 billion doses. Now, this would not have been able without unprecedented efforts, for example, from regulators, every CEO I talk to says kudos to the regulator's willingness to work 24/7 to speed up assessing the data, the dossiers without cutting corners. Unprecedented collaboration and partnerships. I'd never seen something on this scale between big and small. Michel represents the innovative biotech companies. Some of them, it's the first time that ever that they had a vaccine brought to the market. And that's an amazing feat, but also between innovative companies from industrialized countries and developing country vaccine manufacturers. Many of these partnerships already signed and tech transfer starting way in 2020. Therefore, has been an amazing year, but at the end of the year, we also have to admit we dismally failed in terms of equitable rollout, equitable distribution, and that is something we really need to do better in 2022.
Thank you, Thomas. Indeed, as you say, collaboration, partnership, and kudos to the regulators who were working so closely with the manufacturers and conducting rolling reviews. Prasad, you're president of the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network. So it'd be very interesting to just hear about how the developing vaccine manufacturers have all been taking part in this global effort to tackle the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. A good hello to Thomas and Rasmus. Thank you for those good slides. I think the DCVMs, we call them the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers. We're about more than 40 different companies in 15 countries. I would say they've been involved in all aspects of vaccines and vaccinology: innovation, product development, manufacturing, scale up, distribution. I would say the entire spectrum of vaccines and vaccinations they've been involved in. And this is an unprecedented effort. Like Thomas mentioned, a year ago, if you had told me that we would be ready to manufacture, I think DCVMs alone have probably manufactured more than 5 or 6 million doses of vaccines between companies in Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Korea, etc. It's a great effort. And there have been a lot of barriers. We saw trade barriers, we saw barriers for supply chain issues, we saw intellectual property and technology transfers as barriers. We continue to have some of those barriers, while some barriers have been addressed. But I think as an industry as a whole, we need to address these issues and move forward. I think that's one has to be highlighted. I do agree that as successful as industry has been in product development and licensure and manufacturing scale up, we have failed in ensuring equitable access to all people across the world. Certain nations and certain countries seem to have more vaccines available for their populations as opposed to other countries. And I think this has to be addressed on a war footing. Otherwise, we would have a great success of vaccines manufacturing and development, but if it doesn't reach the people that need it the most, I think it would be of no great use for us. Developing country vaccine manufacturers have also innovated. They have developed vaccines, traditional vaccines, inactivated vaccines, viral vector-based vaccines. They've also developed DNA vaccines with novel delivery devices, intradermal delivery devices, painless devices. So many of these innovations are in process. There are DCVMs working on mRNA vaccines and trying to scale it up. And that we would see during 2022, some of these companies coming towards fruition. So I think there is a big body of work, but I would urge that we need to increase equity for vaccines across the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sai, again, for pointing out the contribution in innovation and the numbers of vaccines that have been manufactured by manufacturers in your network. But I think this seems to be a common refrain from everybody. You've just said, Sai, failed in equitable access. Thomas said dismally disappointing. So let's just have a look at that. Sai, how are we going to ensure that is improved going forward? You've mentioned the contribution of developing countries have made to the scale up. What about technology transfer? Is that something that's going to help?
Technology transfer definitely will help. But as you understand, in our industry, technology transfer is not as easy as we think it is. We are one of the most complex industries. Every vaccine goes through several hundred QC tests. There is many, 40 or 50 disciplines of people are required in a vaccine development and a vaccine manufacturing company. So it's not as easy as somebody waving off IPR rights, whereas that's a start. But it has to be followed up with voluntary technology transfer and hand-holding, right from the design and build of a facility to QC assays, to reagents, to manufacturing processes, packaging materials. I mean, it requires in everything. So I think this concept of intellectual property rights, I think everybody tries to simplify it a little bit. But I think what we in industry understand is IPR is important, but it has to be followed through with voluntary technology transfer. That's how we can win the day. And then we need to urge countries and regions to remove artificial barriers, whether those are trade barriers or local manufacturing requirements or any other requirements. Because right now is the time to focus on ensuring vaccines that gets into the arms of people. And we can prepare using this as a case study. We can prepare and develop what kind of toolkit we need to address future vaccines in locally produced countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sai. Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, I could see you were nodding along there when Sai was talking about technology transfer. Perhaps you would like to add some words as far as the role that biotechs can play in that, first of all, just to respond to Sai.
Yes, well, Sai and Thomas are making such incredibly insightful points about what we've seen this year. I mean, we have seen the success of the science. We have seen the success of the biotech ecosystem globally, but we have seen a failure of politics. And the politics is getting in the way of us having the equitable distribution of vaccine doses that we need around the globe. If the simple waiving of IP and of intellectual property would actually stop this pandemic, I think you'd see a different conversation coming from the biotech sector, from the scientists. But what we know, and what Sai was referring to, is that it takes so much more than just the recipe book to get to a useful vaccine that helps people. And our policymakers, while they like the bumper sticker of a TRIPS IP waiver, they fail to really acknowledge the fact that we have over 300 global manufacturing partnerships either underway or planned now by our global vaccine manufacturers and our designers of vaccines all around the world. We're seeing, for example, Pfizer manufacturing their vaccine in South Africa, not only a fill and finish operation, but now they're going to manufacture the entire vaccine in South Africa, and that's going to help us distribute doses throughout Africa. We've got Moderna announcing partnerships in Rwanda. We've got Novavax, who's had its long-term partnership with the Serum Institute in India. So our vaccine manufacturers, from the small biotechs to the large ones, have known from day one that we need to have global partnerships to get vaccines to everyone who needs them. And we don't have enough capacity. We didn't have enough capacity starting out day one, so we had to build new capacity, and they've been at that job tirelessly from the start. Now it is time to remove the political barriers that have stood in the way of making those partnerships successful and as robust as they need to be. So we need to get rid of trade barriers to exporting vaccines to countries who need them. We need to get rid of barriers to exporting and importing the raw materials needed to produce vaccines. Our mRNA vaccines take over 200 components to make. And so any interruption in the supply chain can make it very difficult to deliver fully complete doses to patients. So this is a failure of politics. It's not a failure of the biotech ecosystem. It's not a failure of the science. And we need to start being very frank about that.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath. Thomas, so we're hearing some very strong words there about the failure of politics and certainly the failure in equitable access. Thomas, what more do you think could have been done to improve vaccine equity?
I think when we look at it, we started actually very well, because initially vaccines through COVAX, the collaboration of WHO, Gavi and CEPI, were reaching people in Accra and Abidjan, Kigali on the same day. The very first vaccines were reaching Tokyo. And that was a good start. And even when you look at it, you read quite a lot of negativity about, for example, COVAX, but COVAX initially set out to supply 950 million COVID-19 vaccines to developing countries this year, countries which need financial support for overseas development assistance. They will reach certainly beyond 700 million, maybe almost 800 million, which means not that far from target, notwithstanding the bumps I mentioned with some companies failing to develop a vaccine, others scaling up a vaccine, big companies in industrialized countries, and export restrictions we had for vaccines which were destined for Africa. Therefore, we are not that far from the target. Having said that, whether it's politically or industry, I think, and Sai and Michelle already mentioned it, we need to do better in 2022, and we certainly need to do better beyond 2022. Sai mentioned the complexity of technology transfer. When we look at the geographic diversity of vaccine manufacturing, I think all of us realize that we need to do something about building capacity in Africa. Many of us are involved, whether it's with the European Union, whether it is within individual countries, talking about what can be done for building vaccine manufacturing in Africa. But realistically, this will be for future pandemics, not for this one. For this one, we were calling out with a 5-step plan in May, and the first one was dose sharing, because we did see that the rich countries had moved from hedging at a time where they didn't quite know yet which vaccines would make it and which didn't, to hoarding, where they already in May, it was clear that many of them had far too many vaccines, up to 10 jabs per person in the population. Sadly, it took till September before dose sharing really started. We did talk about scaling up, optimizing production. This happened. We did call out, and I must say, WTO has done a great job in putting together the list of trade barriers, export restrictions, calling out countries to stop these barriers. We also called out the importance of rollout and country readiness, preparedness. And when I look at the situation right now from a global scale, we have moved from supply constraints to absorption constraints. I'm sure all of the journalists online have read about countries reaching out to companies saying, please slow down deliveries. We can't manage. We basically, at current vaccination rates, we have our warehouses are full for the next 5 months. I've been contacted by vaccine manufacturers who said, we have dozens of millions in our warehouse. Can we speed up the procedures for the purchase orders? Can we speed up, make sure that if you do have a WHO emergency use listing, you do have stringent regulatory authorities such as the EMA, MHRA, or FDA, that the countries are willing to accept these regulatory approvals. Therefore, we do believe that we all, and this is not just political, it's also us. We need to do better to make sure that we move from, vaccine supply to vaccination, which should be the order of the day for 2022.
Yes, indeed, Thomas, from, as you say, production to vaccinations in arms. Well, let's now just briefly, and then we'll go to some of the journalists' questions, look ahead at 2022 and some of the challenges. Sai, Prasad, Thomas has just said we need to do better. What do you see as the challenges for developing country manufacturers for next year?
Sure. I think we have quite a few products that are under development. I think they need to see their logical conclusion in terms of product development, regulatory approvals, WHO, EULs, and EULs in many countries. I think that has to happen. We need more products to come into the market so that that would also have an impact of increasing capacity, because these manufacturers have been stockpiling vaccines, many of the products that are under development. I think that has to happen. I think to a great extent, the supply chain barriers, the trade barriers related to supply chain, I think have been addressed. There are a few issues here and there that still have to be looked at closely. I think that we have to continue to keep a close watch on. Most important is now we should be removing any other artificial or political or commercial or trade barriers that exist today. Today, the barriers exist with vaccines available in warehouses of manufacturers and maybe with certain countries, but then there is other part of the world that does not have vaccines. I think that bridge and that gap has to be divided, and there lies the complexity. And if you had told me that this would be a complex issue even 12 months ago, I wouldn't have believed it, but unfortunately it is, and we need to address it.
I just wondered, picking up on something that Thomas said about scaling up of manufacturing in Africa. What's your thoughts there?
I think there are, it's an excellent opportunity for many companies. There are companies already manufacturing in Africa. There are companies that are innovating in Africa. There are mRNA vaccines that are under development. As Thomas mentioned, I think Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and also Moderna, they're all looking at establishing manufacturing in Africa. We ourselves, Bharat Biotech, is actively considering establishing a manufacturing facility in Africa. We are shortlisting countries, talking to potential partners. But again, all of these activities may be partially helpful for this pandemic. What we are looking at is whether we can utilize Africa as a vaccine manufacturing hub, not just as a location of only supplying vaccines to it. Instead of just looking at it as a market, we also look at the human resources, the human capital, and how that can be used to develop and manufacture vaccines as we go along in the future.
Thank you, Sai. Thomas, again, we're looking forward to 2022. I mean, what do you think the industry needs to do more of and better than in 2021?
I think what we have learned just over the last couple of weeks is there's no single silver bullet, which will end this pandemic. It needs persistence, it needs hanging in, it needs perseverance, innovative thinking, collaboration to do that. But we also see that COVID-19 is a moving target. For example, we always emphasize the importance of continue to innovate. And we have heard from companies that they had developed a new COVID vaccine against the beta variant or against the Delta variant. Conclusion was we don't need it because the existing vaccines are still effective enough. I've had quite a number of conversations just over the last few days, including last night. What do you think about Omicron? And there, the honest answer is the jury is still out. The good news is that it looks that existing vaccines are very highly effective against severe disease. And we need to keep our fingers crossed because, as I said, the jury is still out. I talked to a vaccine manufacturer last night who said, actually, I'm not sure that we will need a new vaccine against, the Omicron. And we will see probably over the next few weeks. We need to keep our fingers crossed because if we need a new one, and you saw that on Rasmus' slides, this will impact manufacturing capacity. You need to adjust the manufacturing lines. Fortunately, it can be done in a very short time frame, but we would be better off if we don't. But we don't know what other variants will come up. We also need to do more, realizing that we move from supply constraints to absorption constraints. I think this surge effort, moving from vaccine to vaccination needs support. You do need the budgets, you do need the infrastructure, you need to mobilize community healthcare workers in many countries, you need the cold chains or the fridges. And I think one important element where I hope for innovation next year is shelf life. One of the, everybody has medicines in our medicines cabinet. Normally shelf life is 3 years plus. For most medicines, for the COVID-19 vaccines, on average, it's about 6 months. And rightly, countries in UNICEF, Gavi insist on at least 10 weeks remaining shelf life. Therefore, it's a race against time if you have these vaccines in the warehouses. But you cannot cut corners. You can only extend shelf lives if stability tests show that this is responsible. And we are continue to determine to get ahead of COVID-19, because I have to admit, I see a silver lining at the end, on the horizon. It's not just because as all of us, is COVID pandemic fatigue. I do believe that at the end of the day, science will win, and we will be able to defeat this pandemic. And maybe Omicron, if it is not as severe as Delta, could help us to get this faster.
Thank you, Thomas. Dr. Michel there, science will win. And as we heard from Rasmus right at the opening, there's lots of innovation going on, different alternative routes to administration, many candidates in the pipeline. What for you are the most exciting innovations?
Well, I think Thomas really hit on it. We have seen innovative agility this year. The ability of our manufacturers and our innovators to be able to not just produce one single vaccine or antiviral that seems to make sense and be helpful in the moment, but to be able to rapidly iterate those innovations as well. That is an incredible capacity that we are really seeing coming online and be useful. I remember about a year ago having a conversation with Richard Hatchett from CEPI, and he said, my ideal is that we'll be able to produce a vaccine within 100 days. Well, when Delta came online, Pfizer was able to develop its Delta variant of their vaccine within 84 days. So we're seeing the full realization our scientific hopes and dreams and our ability to shift and weave as the virus shifts and weaves. That being said, there's a lot more to go. The ability to have various routes of administration is going to be critical as we try to get to that last mile of vaccine administration. The ability to have that shelf life and that storage capacity that keeps vaccines very simple to distribute and get to every corner of the globe, that's incredibly important. The ability to combine vaccines so that we're not just vaccinating against COVID, but we're also vaccinating against flu and other respiratory illnesses at the same time. So we're cutting down on multiple different infections at the same time. That is incredibly important. And the therapeutic advances we've seen have been quite dramatic as well. We're focused on vaccines today, but what we've seen in the antiviral space has been incredibly inspiring too. So science will win the day, I have no doubt, but we have to double down on our commitment for public health, because we're seeing, and Bio has been working with Thomas and IFPMA on this from the outset, and we said initially what we need is a global share initiative where we are talking about how we have the vaccine acceptance and the public health infrastructure to actually get shots into arms. That is going to be much more difficult to build and much more important at the end of the day. We are now seeing that prediction come to fruition. And we need to make sure that we are not letting valuable vaccine doses go to waste or be returned to manufacturers because of a failure of public health infrastructure. So a lot more to go, but we're seeing innovation on all of these fronts. And I'm just hopeful that we'll maintain our commitment to make sure that these innovations actually reach and help all patients.
Dr. Michel, just very quickly, of course, innovation on all of these fronts, as you say, but the flip side, and it's quite ironic, is that a lot of people are worried about the speed of innovation, and this has led to some vaccine hesitancy. What do you see as a way to addressing this, which is an issue all over the world?
Well, unlike developing vaccines, addressing vaccine hesitancy is unfortunately not rocket science. We know what works. You know, in the US, we've seen if you get trusted messengers from the communities that really need to be receptive to the vaccine, if you make sure you're in the communities, having frank conversations, answering questions, taking the time to explain things in a jargon-free way that lets people ask questions in a safe environment of people that they can trust and recognize themselves in, you can surmount vaccine hesitancy. We've been very successful on this front in bio in the African American and Latinx communities. We're now extending this to some of our rural and far right-leaning communities and seeing some budging there and some success. But we need to do much more as we tackle vaccine hesitancy globally, because we can't just pronounce vaccines on high. Vaccine delivery is a very ground level game, and you need to have local conversations and local leaders engaged in the process from early on to see success.
Well, thank you very, very much to all of our speakers and to our journalists who have been flooding the chat box with questions. So I'm now opening the floor to the journalists, and there's a question for you, Dr. Michel. It's from Le Monde in France. The question is, with the emergence of new variants, the need for booster doses and the observed vaccine inequalities between countries, isn't the TRIPS waiver relevant to accelerate vaccination? Why are manufacturers opposed to this proposal?
Well, if it actually would address the issue, then we could have a very constructive conversation about how best to move that needle. But what we know about the pandemic today is that we need continued innovation. As we've heard throughout the morning, it's not enough to rest on our scientific laurels and simply deliver the vaccines that we've produced to date. We need to continue to incentivize innovation so that we can get new routes of administration. We can get vaccines that are more effective against new variants. We can get vaccines that are easier to store and deliver to every corner of the world. And you only get that innovation with the IP infrastructure and incentives that we have in place. The biotech ecosystem successfully put out the innovations at record speed. Why would we turn down the speed and the volume of those innovations at this crucial moment? So there's that. There's also the fact that what we're seeing today and what you've seen from the Airfinity data is that we are manufacturing at a huge scale, and we're targeting, we're on track to be able to deliver vaccines to absolutely every person who's eligible for vaccination by March of next year. A triplets waiver is going to do nothing to do that. It takes 18 to 24 months to get a new vaccine manufacturing partnership off the ground and up and running and producing doses that actually can be used, when we're already on track to be able to get enough vaccines to every corner of the globe in very record time. There's also the fact that we are currently seeing, as Thomas referred to earlier, not a supply constraint, but a delivery constraint. We are seeing doses returned that have been delivered to African nations, for example. We are seeing excess supply in some of these key areas of the world. So we need to focus all of our energy, not just a little bit, but all of our energy on making sure that the doses that are arriving to these needy countries are actually getting to patients, and not have this very distracting political debate that actually doesn't move the needle and doesn't save a single life.
Thank you. Let's perhaps stick with the IP waiver. Thomas, there's a question here from the Financial Times. Do you still think the IP waiver, CTAP, are useless? Especially as reported yesterday, it was reported that if richer nations boost everyone and start immunizing children, as some already have, there will be a 3 billion dose shortfall in Q1 2022. Thomas, if you'd like to take that question from the Financial Times.
I think the first is about the 3 billion doses shortfall. To be honest, I have no clue how anybody could come up with this number, because when I look at current vaccination rates on a global scale, even anticipating that you could have a monthly 5 to 10% increase, we still have about 1.3 billion excess doses in the rich countries end of March, which are there to be used for dose sharing, which are there to get into the arms of people. Therefore, this 3 billion sounds scary, but I simply don't believe that it's, based on valid, solid data. And I have to admit, I will ask who actually came up with the number and how did you come up with the number? Since, as usual, on a Thursday evening, we do have an ACT Day principals meeting, and I'm sure that Sai is as much interested as me to get to the roots of that number. It's as an economist, I call these things occasionally voodoo economics or voodoo mathematics. Going back to, the TRIPS waiver, I have always been impressed by, for example, Prasad talking about the 70-point checklist to identify whether potential recipient of a license or technology transfer is capable of, being chosen for partnership. And that's what this is about in terms of making it work to partnerships. It is awfully complex. I've learned years ago that in vaccines, patents are actually even less than the icing on the cake. It is a little bit like, you want to do a MasterChef cake and somebody gives you not just gives you the ingredients, and then you mix the ingredients together and you find out, oh my God, it's a mess. And that's what we actually have seen with some of the most experienced vaccine manufacturers. We have seen 3 of the 4 largest vaccine manufacturers who tried, but they haven't come up with the COVID-19 vaccine. We have seen some of the biggest contract manufacturers utterly failing, which was one of the problems of COVAX in terms of getting the doses for the countries. Therefore, the TRIPS waiver is a little bit of a political distraction, potentially even disruptive, because it could undermine the framework which encouraged this unprecedented partnerships voluntary licensing.
Thank you, Thomas. Sai, a question here from Le Temps, which is a major newspaper here in French-speaking Switzerland. Can we say that China has produced 50% of all vaccines in the world?
I think China has produced quite a bit of vaccines. I don't know the exact number, whether it's 50 or 40 or a little bit more than 50, but there is a significant amount of vaccines that were produced by China. There were vaccines that were produced and vaccinated within the country inside China, and there was also quite a bit that was exported to low-income, middle-income, and high-income countries. So I don't know the exact number, but that's a fair estimate.
Thank you, Sai. Thomas, a question here from Health Policy Watch, and it's about some interpretation of the Airfinity slides. Are we correct to understand from Airfinity slides, Rasmus doesn't see booster campaigns in high-income countries as posing a big threat to global supplies? But shifting to Omicron adapted vaccines could potentially slow down production and create new supply bottlenecks in 2022. So interpretation and perhaps confirmation or otherwise of those Airfinity slides there, Thomas, for Health Policy Watch.
When I look at the estimated surplus of vaccines, even if you use boosters, so actually some of my vaccine friends say, you will simply need a 3rd dose, which means a booster has this negative connotation to some extent, same as I get the seasonal flu jab every year, just out of precaution. even if you would use boosters for the whole adult population, as some countries are now doing, you would still have this 1 billion plus surplus. And you still see that quite a number of rich countries are not able to use the vaccines they have. If you need a totally new vaccine against a Omicron or Omicron plus variant, that I would expect would lead to some disruption. But on the other hand, I'm actually optimistic and confident, and Rasmus on his slides, he had indication we will see new vaccine manufacturers and new vaccines reaching to people next year. I've seen positive results, indicated by the Sanofi GSK collaboration, both of them with huge capacity. We haven't had the Novavax vaccine yet, and I expect actually quite a number of additional new vaccines will come. And that's why I really believe that the issue is not supply constraints. The issue is really make sure that we vaccinate everybody who needs it.
Thank you. And Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, please.
Yes, so I just wanted to add there, Claire, that right now we have to come to terms with the fact that the rate limiting step is vaccine hesitancy, is having the public health infrastructure and the acceptance on the ground to get vaccines into arms. And we've seen a reluctance in the US and in Europe to really promote the use of boosters, or as Thomas puts it, the third dose, out of concern of optics. Well, we don't want to view that we're keeping vaccines from other areas of the world that might need them. And this is incredibly true. We want to make sure that we have enough supply for everyone. But at this point, we need to take the vaccine accepting population as it exists and make sure that they are as protected as the science tells us they can be, so that they can help stop the spread of new variants and the spread of COVID. So we can pursue both simultaneously. We can get vaccine doses out to everyone around the world, but we also need to take advantage of the groundwork that we've laid with people who have already accepted the vaccine to make sure that they stay protected and make sure that they become the backstop to preventing further spread of the virus and further development of variants. That will be more protective for everyone, no matter where you live in the world.
Thank you. Dr. Michel, a question from the Financial Times, which seems a good one for you, but if any of the other speakers would like to add, please do. What do the panelists make of initiatives such as the Afrigen Moderna process and the WHO's tech transfer hub for mRNA vaccines? Michelle.
Yes. Well, every opportunity to share the science and make sure that we have manufacturing partnerships that can effectively deliver vaccine to every corner of the globe should be applauded and should be used and utilized. But we have to make sure that we do this in a way that does not break any of the incentives in the biotech ecosystem that have produced this rapid rate of innovation, because we want to keep that up and coming. So some of these things also work much better for small molecules than they do for biologics. Sai referenced the fact that it's very, very difficult to even qualify to become a vaccine manufacturer. And I think often when we have these conversations about tech transfer, we think about examples in our mind from the small molecule, simple drug, straightforward drug world. And that's why you see companies like Pfizer doing waiving complete IP access and technology transfer for their small molecule antiviral drugs, while realizing that producing vaccines is a much more complex enterprise and has to be done in a much more careful and modulated way, simply by the nature of the science. It has nothing to do with the politics. It's just that the science demands rigor in the case of vaccines.
Thank you. Thomas, two questions here from Le Monde in France and Le Temps here in Switzerland, which is that COVAX often says that it regrets short expiration dates of vaccines that they've received. Is that true? And if it is, are you going to send vaccines with longer expiration dates, or are your members going to do that, Thomas? And also, the WHO says that donated vaccines were close to being outdated. Please comment on this. Thomas, over to you.
shelf life and shelf life expiry is a concern and is an issue. And we have discussed this with companies. And actually, that's why we have recently had a meeting with UNICEF and Gavi to talk about how to increase transparency on likely delivery dates, the concern of shelf life. I haven't heard a single company questioning the need and the insistence on 10-week shelf life. But this is easier said than done, because what I've heard also is it can take up to 45 days before you have a purchase order, before you ship the vaccines once you know it. And this at the time when you already had the shipments to a country which procured wants to donate. And therefore the issue of speeding up procedures is a real one. I've heard concerns from companies who were told that by the time they were really ready to ship, a recipient country said, oh, we are not interested in that vaccine. And then the whole process starts again. I've heard concerns about a company with a vaccine which got WHO emergency use listing, which got FDA, EMA, MHRA, and then the country is not willing to grant, the license for that vaccine. Therefore, there are a lot of complicating factors, but as I see, companies are really willing to, leave no stone unturned and work together with donating countries. I recently had a meeting with a Friends of COVAX country meeting where we talked together about what could be done to make procedures easier, to speed up processes. But the issue right now is no longer shortage of donations or shortage of jabs. The issue really is to make sure that the countries getting these vaccines and waiting for them are ready to put them in the arms of people.
Thank you, Thomas. Prasad, a question here from you from the Indian Express. Vaccine inequity was among the reasons for the emergence of Omicron variant. India has battled a brutal Delta wave. Now, as the Omicron threat lurks, what exactly is the way ahead, since there is no decision on booster doses from the National Technical Advisory Group on immunization in India?
Thank you. Yes, I think the National Technical Advisory Group is reviewing data on booster doses and pediatric doses, pediatric vaccinations in India. I think we need to let them, take their time to review data sets so that they can come up with the right recommendation, especially for a large country like India. In coming specifically to Omicron, there has been, I would say it's early days. We would still have to wait and watch as to how all the different data sets for different vaccines fall. Some vaccines with 2 doses in the early days don't seem to be effective. Some vaccines with a booster dose seems to be effective. Whether product developers like us, we have to think about developing a new variant-specific vaccine or an existing vaccine with a booster dose that helps. I think all of these questions are under review and under scientific discussion and product development and research in many of our companies. And we are unable to give concrete answers at this time because it's purely science. I mean, in science, we can't take liberties and innuendos in responding. So we have to wait until we see all the data, and then many companies will come through with their recommendations.
Thank you, Sai. Thomas, I'm combining 3 questions here, so I hope you have a pen ready. From Politico and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and also Le Monde in France. COVAX officials keep on saying companies are still prioritizing bilateral deals and not supplying COVAX when they should. Is that correct? Following on from that question, which was from Politico, if this is correct, please explain why COVAX deals are not being honored. Manufacturers were pointed about the lack of transparency on the number and the planning of vaccine deliveries to COVAX. Will you make changes to improve transparency on that? So, Thomas, a range of questions there related to COVAX.
Now, as I indicated, COVAX will be close to reaching, the original 950 million target for developing countries, so-called AMC countries. Those are the 93 countries benefiting from financial assistance. The main, reason why COVAX is below the original 2 billion target is that basically the rich countries all bought for themselves and therefore do not rely on COVAX. When you look at why is COVAX slightly below, a few weeks behind reaching the target, I think there are two main reasons. It is not the vaccine manufacturers prioritizing bilateral deals. The two main reasons are there were serious bottlenecks, disruptions in scaling up manufacturing, which have hit a couple of big vaccine manufacturers, and that impacted everyone, not just COVAX. And the second reason is there were export restrictions. For example, COVAX initially was planning to rely heavily on supplies from India, because the vaccine from the Serum Institute, the AstraZeneca one, was considered the one best suited for vaccination in Africa. And when you look at the big surge in the spring this year, India basically stopped exporting for about 7-8 months. It has now restarted, but that also had an impact and was compensated to a large extent by dose sharing, for example, from the European Union and from the US, but that had an impact. In terms of calls for transparency, there are two issues. One is, as I've heard again and again, there are sudden challenges and disruptions unexpected, and that does create problems. On the other hand, I think companies have clearly heard the message. I did mention that we did sit down recently with the various vaccine manufacturers and Gavi and UNICEF. They are the two key for the rollout, for the delivery. We also have to quad the coming together of WTO with IMF, World Bank, and WHO. And my sense of what I hear from the manufacturers as well as COVAX is delivery transparency has vastly improved.
Thank you, Thomas. Sai, two questions here from Indian Express and also from Health Policy Watch in Geneva. They're wanting to know whether your network is working on mRNA vaccines and scaling them up. What COVID vaccines is the network already producing besides Bharat Biotech, and where? And where are the prospects for members of the network to get into the mRNA vaccine manufacture, or are they all there already? So a couple of questions there for you, Sai.
Sure. I'll try to remember all of those and answer them. There has been an initiative by the WHO to develop an mRNA vaccines hub. That is now started and taken root in South Africa. There are companies
unfortunately
actively working on developing and bringing up mRNA vaccines. And also,
Sai, your line is breaking up a little bit, so perhaps you might want to reconnect, and I'll come back to those questions to you in a moment, if I may. In the meantime, Thomas, let me just go to the Daily Telegraph in the UK. Panel members have talked about failing to ensure equitable access. What do you think could solve this issue? Is there a shifting attitude towards an IP waiver, Thomas? And then when Sai reconnects, we'll go back to those questions on mRNA vaccines. But Thomas, those questions from the Daily Telegraph in the UK.
I can't see how an IP waiver would improve vaccine equity, because it might jeopardize, this unprecedented number of partnership tech transfer, which is based on voluntary partnerships, voluntary collaboration. The scaling up, the trebling of global vaccine capacity we have seen within a year would not have been possible without that. Also, the coming in of many manufacturers from developing countries, but also from big pharma companies who have signed contract manufacturing deals and manufactured for others. The TRIPS waiver would not address that. The issue with short-term, it continues to be dose sharing. And we have seen, for example, the US government coming in big way, procuring vaccines destined just for COVAX. I think that will have a huge impact on equity. When we talk about equity for the future, I think we really need to go back to where we were a year ago or 2 years ago, because one of the problems which hampered COVAX was at the beginning, COVAX was late in the game. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the funds, they were not allowed to sign the checks for the big purchases at the time when you had the US, Canada, EU, and many others doing exactly that. Therefore, by the time COVAX came in, most of the capacity had been sold. That's why dose sharing really is the way to do it. And therefore, one really needs to make sure that for future pandemic, you have, arm's length, you do have a pot where COVAX or COVAX Mark II is equipped to be in. We need also a kind of social contract, which is based on making sure that vaccines go to those most in need based on public health assessment, like frontline healthcare workers, like vulnerable population. That is not populating the whole world, 70% of the population at the same time, but it should make sure that the healthcare workers, that's about 1% of the global population, the elderly on the global level, that's about 10% of the global population. I think that is something doable, but we need to make sure that we are talking now, how can we avoid the problems we ran into now? Because I think everybody is ashamed and embarrassed about the inequitable access we see right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Sai, for reconnecting. And I'll just say those questions again from the Indian Express and Health Policy Watch Geneva. There's a lot of interest in whether your network is working on mRNA vaccines and scaling them up. And which ones are you working on, and where are the prospects for members of the network to get into this mRNA vaccine manufacturer, or are they there already, Sai?
Yes, companies in our network are already working on mRNA vaccines. There is a mRNA vaccines hub in South Africa. There are companies in Africa that are working on it. There are companies in Latin America also that are working on it. The WHO is spearheading this effort. They have called for participation by other companies, most recently as the first week of December. And I think several additional companies have also applied to be a part of this developmental process with mRNA vaccines. So I think you would see in 2022 and beyond, several DCVMs manufacturing and actively developing mRNA vaccines. There is already a company in India called Geneva that they are working on an mRNA vaccine. They're doing phase 2 clinical trials right now. Other than that, vaccines, there are companies manufacturing and developing vector-based vaccines, live adenovirus vector vaccines. A company called Zydus Cadila has developed a DNA vaccine, which is given through the skin, a painless delivery device. We are developing an intranasal vaccine that could be given as drops into a nostril, which is much easier. So I think there is a lot of innovation that is going on in the developing countries also, and you will see this in the second wave of vaccines to come. Thank you.
Sai, a question about some of the innovation there from the Sunday Times, wondering what efforts amongst your members in your network of developing polyvalent vaccines?
Yes, so there are quite a few companies that are looking at polyvalent vaccines, but to address that, we need to know whether a vaccine that's developed against, let's say, the alpha variant is also protective against the beta and the delta and the Omicron variants. I think these questions are not fully resolved. As you would have looked at the data for the beta and the delta variants, the original vaccines were still protective. But for the Omicron variant, we're still awaiting more data to understand this. So I think time will tell, but I think all companies are equipped Flu vaccines have 4 strains in them or 3 strains in them that are announced every year between May and June. And within 3 months, companies are able to manufacture millions of doses and supply it around the world. We're not sure whether COVID and SARS-CoV-2 is also moving in that direction, but I think the Omicron variant it'll be a telltale information and data set when we receive it, and we will know that. But that knowledge, that technology, that formulation process is already available with many, many companies.
Obviously, there's a lot of concern about the Omicron variant. A question here from Fierce Farmer for Michelle. With the uncertainty created by Omicron, what impact will that have on pharma industry planning in 2022? Also, how will that potentially impact the inequitable distribution of vaccines going forward? Michelle.
Yes, well, I can tell you that all of our manufacturers and innovators, small and large, are paying very close attention to all of the variants and following the data very carefully on a daily and sometimes hourly basis. And you could tell from the Airfinity presentation that it's a very delicate balance between making sure you have at the ready the science to be able to produce a unique vaccine for a new variant if necessary, with the public health reality as to whether or not it makes sense to divert some of the precious and resource constrained raw materials to developing a variant specific vaccine, or to double down on our current confirmation of vaccines. So far, the data on Omicron says that we should stay the course and not divert our manufacturing capacity and our raw materials to Omicron-specific vaccines. But you can be sure that our manufacturers will have that science at the ready if the data changes and it becomes clear that we need something quite different. So each and every variant is considered in the same delicate balance and will continue to be examined in this way as we go forward.
The international pharmaceutical quality. Thomas, a question. Can you please talk about the regulatory challenges that are being positively addressed, particularly through the IFPMA and International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities workshop on enabling vaccine manufacturing, which I believe they say happened in July?
I believe that actually regulators around the world deserve a big call out. When you look how fast, they processed the submissions, and the submissions done on large-scale clinical trials, 40 to 60,000 people involved in the clinical trials, that they accepted to do some of the normal work in parallel rather than sequence, that they accepted rolling submissions without cutting corners. I think it has been simply amazing. One of the elements which were discussed in this workshop between the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Agencies and IFPMA and member companies were also about the technical elements, manufacturing standards, and so on, because we really need to ensure that the vaccines which reach to people are safe, of high quality, have been checked for good manufacturing processes, and that requires dialogue, respecting each other's competencies. At the end of the day, it's the regulators who need to call the shots. It's them who need to decide whether vaccine meets the efficacy and target product profile. And I think they've done an amazing job, and they will require to continue doing so. I'm sure that Michelle would be much more competent in answering the question as a former FDA official, because if we need new vaccines against, for example, Omicron or another variant, you will only be able to reach these 100-day mission targets if regulators are willing, again, to do the extra mile, to do not the as usual. But maybe, Michelle, you can add there.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. You're absolutely right. What we've seen from global regulators over the last year has been nothing short of Herculean and heroic all at the same time. My concern is that it may not be sustainable. Many of our regulatory agencies are understaffed, under-resourced, and they're struggling to keep up. And we've already seen the impact of the diversion of resources to COVID in terms of their ability to be able to cover their regulatory duties for other therapeutic areas. So this is something that we have to address going forward. The other thing that COVID shined a very bright light on is the ability or the need for us to really harmonize our regulatory standards. It makes sense, for example, to have the EMA and the FDA working very closely to make sure that they're aligned on regulatory decisions around these emerging technologies that are very exciting and very breakthrough. But does it make sense for us to have 150 different regulatory regimes around the world that companies are trying to navigate as they're trying to get new and emerging vaccines out to fight emerging illnesses and viruses? So we need to think about global regulatory harmonization and simplification. We need to think about how we shore up the capabilities and resources of our regulatory entities so that they can continue to be incredibly vigilant as they have been when it comes to new COVID vaccines and therapeutics. And we need to think about making sure that we keep the regulatory decisions separate from the politics. We want to make sure that if we're just discussing a booster, for example, that the decision is based on the science and not on the politics. And we've seen that this has not always necessarily been the case as the conversation has progressed around the globe.
Michelle and Thomas, there's a question directed to both of you. I'll start with Michelle. It's from Politico, which says, why is inequity only about politics? Pharma companies sold so much of their supply to rich countries. Doesn't that mean that it helped them hoard? So Michelle, your answer, and then Thomas.
Well, I'll give you an example to help hit home the point. In the US, we saw quite understandably when the new administration came in January and when was facing a very critical stage of the pandemic, the invocation of the Defense Production Act. It sounded good on a headline. Let's make sure that we are vaccinating all Americans. But what that turned out to be is an export restriction that kept our US manufacturers from filling some of their global supply orders that had been placed around the globe. It also resulted in export restrictions of some of those 200 raw materials needed to manufacture mRNA vaccines around the globe. So it incredibly hastened the disparity that we knew we would be facing and fighting. And it was out of the hands of the manufacturers to fill those global orders. They were mandated by the government to fill their US orders first. So that is the type of politics that really has an impact on equity. And actually some of those restrictions persist and continue to exacerbate the inequity. So I think we have to deal with that low-hanging fruit before we cast dispersion on manufacturers that are actually really trying to get their vaccines and their technology and their manufacturing partnerships up and working around the globe.
Thomas, briefly over to you, and then I'm going to take two more questions before we end the media briefing. Thomas, your view on that question from Politico.
I think I can only echo what Michelle said at the beginning. The rich countries, they were actually critical in terms of speeding up development and scaling up manufacturing, because a lot of that was done with risk sharing, for example, between BARDA and many manufacturers. But initially also, I think these countries were concerned that the vaccines on which they placed advanced purchasing orders wouldn't make it. And we have seen, out of those 300 vaccine development projects, we have now about 10 which are used widely. Many failed. Nobody talks about that. And that did create a problem in terms of initially they were hedging the risks, then they started to hoard, and it took too long to react. I think we have seen change over the last few months. For example, I do know that out of the 3 billion plus capacity which Pfizer BioNTech are producing this year, 40% are going to low and middle income countries. Quite a bit of that through COVAX, but even more so through countries or the African Union have placed direct orders, the same with the J&J or AstraZeneca or Moderna. We have seen a change, and I really hope that we are going to see also a change of consciousness. If we do need new vaccines for new variants, we need to talk about better equitable access and distribution upfront, and not in 5 years, but next year.
Thomas, another question about COVAX from Le Monde. Over the last few months, the deliveries to COVAX have accelerated, but lots of countries still lack vaccines to reach the 40% target of having their population vaccinated. How do manufacturers explain such disparities? What did you do wrong?
Now, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not quite sure whether these countries signed up to the 40% target around the world, but many countries don't have the vaccines they need and want. Some countries apparently deliberately said, we do not want to get those doses. Therefore, it's really complex, but overall, we really need a surge effort. We need to invest in the infrastructure absorption. And Michel and Sai addressed the issue of vaccine hesitancy. Let's face it, I'm Swiss. I'm embarrassed about the low vaccination rate in my country. We have too many vaccines, but we don't seem to be able to get beyond the 70% of the adult population mark. And it's even worse in some other parts of the world. Therefore, there are multiple reasons why so far we are not there. But I think we should be able to really reach the 70% of the eligible population target by UN General Assembly next year. But we need to work together, all.
Thomas, and the last question here from the DPA, the Deutsche Presseagentur, the German press agency. Human Rights Watch identified 100 companies that could manufacture mRNA if they got the technology, all of them qualified by the European Medicines Agency, the FDA, or WHO for manufactured sterile injectables or certified to adhere to GMP standards. Why are these not used?
To be honest, I have serious doubts about, all the people who claim that they have the technology, they would be able. I was once on a morning talk show of the BBC where a vaccine manufacturer from Bangladesh said, if only, somebody would. But then when he looked into it, he said, yes, of course, I need to get the list of raw materials. I need to get the engineers, I need to get the scientists. And he was talking about AstraZeneca. He was talking about the vaccine, which is produced at large scale in India, which means he said, oh, it's not just about the IP. I actually need these people to come here and show me how to do it. I must say, when I look at CEPI, and CEPI is a well-respected agency, they've done a survey. They talked about 61 potential manufacturers able to do, but most of them were just fill and finish. And let's face it, and I think Prasad has said it before, vaccine manufacturing, whether it's classical vector vaccines or mRNA, is anything but easy. Therefore, not everybody who claims to be the master chef will be able to fill my expectation when it comes to having a decent dinner. And therefore, I would treat these kind of claims with a grain of salt.
Thank you, Thomas. Michelle, you would like to say something?
So I think it also neglects to pay attention to the 300 global manufacturing partnerships that have been stood up since the beginning of the year. Almost every corner of the globe that has the capacity to build and be able to produce these vaccines is being utilized. We didn't go from a global vaccine manufacturing capacity of 5 billion doses to producing 11.5 billion doses in a year by not using every opportunity to produce more vaccine. So I think we have to pay attention to what's underway and what's being built before we kind of blithely say that it could be done in so many more places. It's even been very, very difficult to bring those 300 online, where you have very, very close relationships and partnerships between the innovators and the manufacturers.
Thank you very much. To wind up this media briefing, I'd like to give the floor finally to Thomas Cueni, Director General of IFPMA, for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I really first want to thank Michelle, McMurry-Heath and Prasad for joining us here. And basically, when you look at Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network and IFPMA come together, it's really exemplary for business not as usual. It's exemplary for partnership and coming together. Until a couple of years ago, I didn't know either of them. But over the last 2 years, we really work together. I think 24/7, be it on Act A principles, be it on the COVAX CCM. And I've never seen such a closeness and a feeling of we need to pull out all stops. We need to do whatever is needed. We wouldn't have seen this trebling of global vaccine capacity without this 300 partnerships, the more than 200 technology transfers, without really this coming togetherness. And because it is daunting, and let's face it, it continues to be daunting. And when I look forward into 2022 and Omicron, which now keeps us awake at night, I think we really need to make sure that we get the vaccines to those who are waiting for them, because vaccination gives everybody the best protection against the pandemic and is the best tool to end the pandemic. But the second one is really we need to continue driving innovation. We talked about shelf lives, we talked about stability, we talked about new vaccine, and therefore the challenge there is continued innovation. But also I think what we have seen from the data shared by Rasmus, Bech, Hansen is the challenge now is vaccination, it is not vaccine. And in order to do that, I think we really need urgent, concrete measures. We need a surge effort. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown has called out for this surge, for big dose sharing, but also for support from, everyone able to contribute support to make sure that the vaccines get to where they are needed. But it also requires investment and funding in country readiness. You need to have the cold chains. You need to have the infrastructure to make sure that the vaccines get from the tarmac into the arm of the people, and you need the health force. Michelle has again emphasized the importance of regulatory oversight, where we rely on them to help, based on solid science-based evidence, to extend shelf life. And we need to make sure that regulatory approval is done before the vaccines reach the tarmac, before they are in the country. We also need to take on vaccine hesitancy. I've been struck a year ago by the book published by Heidi Larson, addressing, the multiple reasons causing vaccine hesitancy way before COVID-19. And it hasn't been plain sailing. We have seen actually some of the biggest, most seasoned vaccine manufacturers failing or being seriously delayed. Therefore, we really need to continue innovation, continue scaling up, and continue to make sure, and in particular, address this inequity of vaccines. With this, I do hope that we are seeing a silver line. Maybe Omicron is, the beginning of the end of the pandemic. Let's keep our fingers crossed. But thanks to Sai and Michelle and you, Claire, for joining me. And thanks for all the journalists for having tuned in. I wish all of you a festive season and hopefully a couple of weeks break. I think we need a rest.
Indeed, Thomas, thank you. And journalists, you can find a recording of this media briefing on the IFPMA website. So please have a good break and stay safe and stay well. Thank you.